Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Joining us on today's show is the former Grand Forks Herald editor and publisher, Mike Jacobs. Mike, thanks for joining us today.
Bet. Glad to be here.
Well, you're here today to talk about your new book out, The Bank of North Dakota, and we're going to get to that in a few moments. But before we do that, tell the folks a little bit about yourself and your background.
I've been around a long time, and starting to reflect on that. I'm originally from Montreal County and came to Grand Forks to attend the university in 1965. So I was there in those great years at the end of the 60s. And then I've worked around the state, Dickinson and Mandan and Jamestown and here in Fargo, and sort of ended up in Grand Forks. Started as the legislative reporter for the Grand Forks Herald, and as they say, the rest is history.
Well, there's a lot of history there, and we'll get into some of that, but let's talk about what got you started in writing this book.
Eric Hardmeyer, who is the president of the Bank of North Dakota, approached me in September of 2015 or 16, and pointed out, as I knew, that the bank was about to celebrate its centennial, and wondered if I'd be interested in writing a history of the bank. And I've been interested in North Dakota history, of course, and particularly in the bank, because it's a unique institution in the United States. And so I said yes, and we came to terms, so to speak, and the book is the result, with a lot of help from a lot of other people. But I'm managed to put the story together in a readable form, I hope, well, supplemented with a whole lot of photographs that really help to make this kind of a book, a coffee table book, appealing.
Yeah. Well, tell us how the book started.
The bank, of course, has been the subject of a great deal of interest ever since it was organized in the late teens. There have been a couple of other books about the bank and numerous investigations. It drew a lot of attention when it was formed, and that attention hasn't abated. I think the impulse really was that the previous histories of the bank, particularly the one by Roseanne Junker, which was published in the 70s, had become rare and difficult to find and expensive and not up to date. Not her fault, of course. She was writing in the late 70s, and so President Hardmeyer was interested in bringing the story up to date. Basically, I went through the material that there is. There's a previous book that was written as a master's degree or a doctoral dissertation at Columbia, almost immediately after the bank survived the big test in the early 1920s. And there have been innumerable investigations. This just happens to be one volume of the investigation of 1921. This is the Senate investigation conducted by the Nonpartisan League, which was essentially in charge. There's two more volumes from the House, which was in charge of the regular Republicans who were critics of the bank, and this goes on and on and on. Just as an example of the incredible detail, you can find out who every check was issued to, and what every school district deposited. So it's a treasure trove of information that somebody might want to go through, but it's just an indication of how polarized the political situation was in those years.
Well, do people realize today just how radical it was with creating the bank? And
I think that there is an understanding and an appreciation of the uniqueness of the bank and the conditions that brought the bank to being established. But I don't think that anybody sees the bank now as a particularly radical idea. It's become part of the way North Dakota does business. There's a lot of interest in it in other states. I think one of the reasons that Eric Hardmeyer was interested in a book was that he could hand something to somebody rather than having to endlessly repeat the story about the bank. And since it's been published, I've been, you know, I've had calls from a number of organizations and state governments that are interested in the bank, and so I always try to sell them a book, of course.
Sure. Well, you talk about the 20s. It almost went away, I understand, in 1921.
Well, you know, the bank is a product of the Nonpartisan League, and the league really. We think of the League as a radical political organization, basically because of its leftist orientation, its desire to curb the abuses that they perceived in big business, but it also was a progressive political organization in the sense that it favored participatory democracy. And so in some ways, the League was its own worst enemy because it favored, initiated constitutional amendments, made them easier, and tellingly, one of those amendments was the ability to recall state officials. And so after the bank was established, its critics got together and distributed petitions to recall the people who formed the bank, the Industrial Commission, the governor, the Attorney General, and the Agriculture Commissioner, all of them NPL officials, and all of them recalled from office in an election in October 28th, 1921, in the wake of this investigation that I was pointing out earlier. So all of those officials were recalled from office, the first recall of a governor in the nation's history, and one of only two even yet. They were all recalled, but the effort to revoke the charter of the bank, in other words, to put a stake in its heart, failed. So at the same time that the people who ran the bank were defeated, the bank itself was supported. And the governor who was elected, Rangvold Nestos was his name, a remarkable character, said, you know, they want me and they want the bank, so I'm going to try to make this work. Almost certainly, if Nestos had said, we're done with this, the bank wouldn't have survived. But the fact that people had supported the bank in that election, even while they rejected the bank's managers, saved the bank, essentially. And from that time, it became, it continued as a state-owned bank, of course, and it continued, it's a captive depository. I mean, all of the state's money goes to the state bank. And at the time, one of the issues used against the bank was that it initially required all public deposits, so that school districts in wherever, I have a warrant from Waback, North Dakota, which was required to deposit its money in the state bank, and that was tremendously controversial. But the bank survived all of that, and the initial conservatives, shall we call them, they called themselves stalwarts or independent voters or whatever. Their initial impulse was to kill the bank and the mill and elevator, and very polarized politics at that time. But when the election was held, the bank was supported. They went ahead with it and resolved to try to make it work in a much less activist way until, of course, the days of Bill Langer particularly, and Frank Vogel, who was his bank president. So then there was another sort of activist period, and then a very reactionary period, shall we say, really pulled the bank in through the 1940s, 1950s, other than sort of feel-good loans for veterans, returning veterans and the like. The bank was not very active until the 1960s, when Bill Guy and Herb Thorndall and Martin Stenjum came into the bank and began to look for ways to make it a much more activist institution. The 60s are especially remembered, of course, for the student loan program. Mm-hmm. But there are other things to talk about the 60s as well. But.
Well, you've spouted off so much, so many eras there, and so much. So how did you go about doing the research of the book? I mean, you didn't have all this in your head when you started.
No, of course not. We immediately scheduled interviews with almost all of the living members of the Industrial Commission, and so there were interviews with. The current commission, Doug Goring, the Ag Commissioner, Wayne Stenjum, who is Martin Stenjum's son, the Attorney General, Doug Burgum, and Heidi Heitkamp, John Hoeven, Myron Just, Al Olson back into the 80s. Unfortunately, a really critical figure in the bank's history, Joe Lamb, who was the president of the bank in the Sinner administration, has passed away, and we weren't able to interview him. But there's a good deal of documentation about the Joe Lamb was a credit hawk. There had been some maybe not very well vetted loans made at the bank in the early 80s, and when Joe Lamb came in, he took care of all of that. He always referred to it as bad paper, a banking term, not a newspaper term, and then Governor Sinner began a much more aggressive program of involving the bank in economic development through various kinds of beginning farm programs, community loan programs, and the like.
So that's what you said. I was going to say, what kind of loans and things does the bank specialize in today? It's college programs and farmers loans, is that it?
No. I think probably the most important function of the bank now is to enlarge the credit capacity of private banks in the state. So the bank is actively involved in buying up, so to speak, loans that local banks would not be able to handle on their own because of federal regulations and the like. The bank's great advantage, this is a little bit ironic, is that it's not regulated by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. It is, of course, it's audited and all of that. But because it is able to participate in loans around the state that private local banks would be unable to finance, and banks outside of the state might be less enthusiastic about because they have other loans to make. They have other money to push around.
Sure. Well, now you've labeled this as one of the most successful publicly owned companies,
except the Green Bay Packers.
Okay, in the United States. Why is that?
I think because it so exactly fit a need that North Dakotans perceived, and it responded. There was a lot of controversy, but in the long run, it responded in ways that North Dakotans appreciated. It solved the money problem in a way that without it would have been much more difficult. In the 20s, Bill Conker, who was the academic vice president at UND while I was a student there, wrote his thesis, his doctoral dissertation on the banking crisis in North Dakota in the 20s, when there was a very sharp contraction of credit and many banks failed. And the Bank of North Dakota was sort of there to even things out, and that sort of conservative credit we'll back you up kind of attitude prevailed and continues to prevail in the state bank.
Well, Mike, is the bank basically socialist in nature, despite conservative business practices?
Of course it's socialist. The definition of socialism is public ownership. And so yes, it falls into the definition of socialist. But I think the important difference here is that the people who started the bank saw it as a tool that they could use to solve problems that they perceived, and it has done that. If the bank had not been established, every other state has solved these problems through private banking. Other banks tried public banking, and it didn't succeed anywhere else. But North Dakota has particular issues in location and a one-crop economy for most of its history, and so on. So could North Dakota have been successful without the bank? Maybe. Has the bank made North Dakota more successful? Certainly.
Okay. Well, Mike, can you read a passage from your book?
Yeah, this is what I call the angels sing passage. Every writer wants something at the end that just sort of sums it all up. So I think this is a summation of the bank that probably North Dakotans can relate to. It's true that interaction with the bank is minimal for most North Dakotans. There are only 3 tellers at the bank and no ATMs. Yet the bank has an impact on every North Dakotan. Tens of thousands of residents have received loans from the Bank of North Dakota. Hundreds of farms and businesses have been helped by its credit policies. Transfers from its earnings have helped the state balance its budget, thus extending state services while keeping taxes down. The bank has reached into North Dakota lives and communities in many ways, supporting students, helping victims of flood and drought, creating jobs, aiding communities in improving their services, creating partnerships with private banks to help beginning farmers and business entrepreneurs, pretty much just plain making life better in North Dakota.
Mike, you mentioned this. Is it ironic that in a red state like North Dakota, there is a Bank of North Dakota and a state mill and an elevator?
Well, this would be, I could go on about this far longer than we have, but North Dakota's heritage is, political heritage, is more progressive, more participatory than most other states. At the same time, there's a deeply conservative, both morally and economically, strain in North Dakota. And so the bank sort of answers both of those issues. It keeps our money, at home, and it does good. So it sort of answers that imperative to be conservative, morally and economically, while it is undeniably a tool that a government program that people saw as a tool to address these problems.
Mike, I'm sitting here looking through. Can you talk about the photographs that you have in here?
Beth Enfield at the bank did a real search for photographs. This is the chamber in the old Capitol building at the time when the bank was being debated. On the 25th of February 1919, when the bank bill passed, the league was conscious that they were making history, and they brought in a film crew and bunting all over the place. This is A.C. Townley, who was the leader of the NPL and an important an organizing genius and a gifted orator, a charlatan in some ways, particularly later in his life. But here he is haranguing a crowd. I don't remember exactly where it is, but my dad remembered A.C. Townley coming to.
Well, I'm just flipping through. There are so many great pictures in here.
Yeah, it's really Beth at the bank, and Chad Hotzenbuehler is the designer. Janelle Schmitz was the project manager. Clay Jenkinson, who has been on this program, a scholar, and had a lot of insight about the book. And so it's you know, there's one name on the cover, but there's a lot of other names inside.
You've mentioned the governors quite often throughout the talk here. You talk about it being Bill Guy's bank during his 12 years in office, for example.
Well, Bill Guy had a particular challenge because he had notions about how the bank could be used to further economic development, and he, of course, was elected the same year that John Kennedy was elected, and the Kennedy administration had a notion about how underserved areas of the country, underdeveloped areas of the country, could be served. You know, of course, Kennedy famously won the West Virginia primary, basically promising, we're going to lift you up. And Bill Guy took him up on the notion. They were both Navy veterans, but he was the only Democrat on the Industrial Commission for most of his tenure, maybe all of his tenure. And so he had a very challenging time bringing more conservative political thinkers along on his ideas. One of the great accomplishments of the Bill Guy years was the student loan program. The Bank of North Dakota sold the first federally guaranteed student loan, and tens of thousands of students got loans that otherwise might not have been able to go to college, and that's just an incredibly important thing. There are other things that the bank did, but the real economic activism of the bank came a little bit later.
Mike, are there other institutions like this in other states?
There are no state-owned banks. Puerto Rico has a sort of public credit organization, and Delaware, of course, is the other state that's notorious for its economic innovations. And they don't have a state bank, but they do have a unique way of chartering corporations, and so you know, they're sort of at the other extreme. They did experiment with state banking. Virginia had a state bank. Kentucky had a state bank at one time. But you know, banking is one of the touchstone issues in American history. You don't need to scratch very far to find banking issues in American history.
Well, Mike, you seem to have a deep history in North Dakota, obviously. Did you learn anything new in writing this book?
Oh yeah. Oh sure. You know, a lot of what is believed about the bank is exaggerated. Some of the stories about the bank are just not true. I think that one of the things that was most revealing was the individuals who at critical times made critical decisions that could have gone either way, but they were certain enough in their understanding of what the people wanted. One of the early critical decisions was, how is this going to be governed? The ideologues in the Nonpartisan League, that is to say the economic purists, the socialists, shall we call them, wanted a 7-member appointed board, and the leaders of the league said, absolutely not. We're going to have this board be elected and responsible, and went so far as to make it possible for them to be recalled. You know, without that, if there had been the kind of dissatisfaction with the bank and an appointed board, you know, the bank probably wouldn't have survived. But the fact that the bank leaders were recalled and the bank itself was supported led the state to accept that this was a tool that they could use and develop.
Mike, what do you hope people take away from the book?
What I really hope people take away from the book is that this is a very interesting place. This is certainly not the only great story about North Dakotans and the way that North Dakotans responded to challenges that came along. I'm currently working on a lecture about presidents in North Dakota history, and it's really interesting how the state has responded to opportunities that come along. So it's an interesting place, and as Deborah Marquardt, who wrote a book about growing up in Napoleon, said, if I'd known how interesting my hometown was, I would have loved it more.
Mike, we're out of time. I know people can get a copy of the book at different places. We'll inform them of that. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, that's all we have on Prairie Post this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funding provided by the members of Prairie Public.